It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when Walter Jenkins, a retired mechanic who still found solace in the hum of engines and the scent of motor oil, stepped out of his modest workshop to catch the first rays of sunlight. The sleepy little town, with its weathered brick storefronts and creaky wooden porches, was just beginning to stir. Walter's workshop, tucked at the edge of town, was more of a refuge than a business these days. He didn't need to work, retirement checks paid his bills, but the thought of sitting idle in his quiet house since Martha passed filled him with unease. Fixing old cars gave his hands a purpose and his mind a sense of rhythm, even if most of his customers these days were locals with more gratitude than money. That's when he saw it, the car. It wasn't just any car. Parked haphazardly in front of the shop was a once elegant sedan, its deep green paint now chipped and dulled by time. Walter's practiced eyes immediately caught the signs of neglect: deflated tires, rust nibbling at the edges of the wheel wells, and windows so caked in dirt they reflected the morning light like frosted glass. Something about the car seemed out of place. It didn't belong to anyone in town, at least not anyone he recognized. The license plate was from out of state, faded and bent at one corner, as if it had been hastily attached long ago. Walter walked around the car, his boots crunching against the gravel, his curiosity piqued. Abandoned vehicles weren't unheard of. Sometimes city folk would break down on their way through and leave their troubles behind. But this one felt different. His hand instinctively reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Peering inside, he saw a once plush interior, now reduced to tatters. The driver's seat was split wide open, revealing yellowed foam padding spilling out like an old wound. Papers were scattered across the floor, most too crumpled or faded to read, but one caught his eye. It was a black and white photograph wedged between the passenger seat and the console. Walter squinted, his heart skipping a beat as he made out the faces, a young couple, smiling warmly at the camera, standing in front of what looked like an old diner. Their clothes were distinctly 1950s, the man in a leather jacket, the woman in a polka dot dress. The photo stirred something deep within Walter, a memory of simpler times, of jukebox tunes and soda fountains, of falling in love under the glow of neon lights. His thumb brushed against the edge of the photo as he carefully slid it into his pocket. He wasn't sure why, but he felt an obligation to keep it safe. Returning his attention to the car, Walter muttered to himself, "Who just leaves a beauty like this out here?" It wasn't in his nature to let a mystery sit idle, so he grabbed his toolbox from the shop and got to work. The hood popped open with a creak, revealing an engine coated in grime but otherwise surprisingly intact. Walter's eyebrows lifted in mild astonishment. "Huh? You're not as far gone as you look," he said, almost as if speaking to an old friend. Hours slipped by as he inspected the vehicle, taking notes of what could be salvaged and what might need replacing. The engine, though weathered, seemed to have been serviced recently. It was an odd contrast to the car's exterior. Whoever had owned this vehicle had cared about it until they hadn't. As the afternoon wore on, Walter decided to tackle the trunk. It was jammed shut, the lock rusted and stubborn, but Walter's determination outweighed the obstacle. After some effort and a bit of cursing, he managed to pry it open. What greeted him stole the breath from his lungs. The trunk was filled, not with old tools or forgotten belongings, but with cash. Bundles of it, neatly stacked, wrapped in brittle rubber bands, and packed so tightly they barely shifted as the trunk lid lifted. Walter froze, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. His calloused hand hovered over the stacks, hesitant to touch them, as if afraid they might vanish the moment he did. The air around him seemed to thicken, the distant hum of the town fading into silence. A lifetime of hard work had left Walter no stranger to financial struggle. He and Martha had scrimped and saved, making do with what they had, never daring to dream beyond their modest means. Seeing so much money, more than he'd ever laid eyes on in one place, felt like stepping into another world. And yet, it wasn't excitement he felt. It was dread. His stomach knotted as questions flooded his mind. Who would leave this kind of fortune behind? Was it stolen? Was someone looking for it? And most pressing of all, what was he supposed to do with it? Walter's thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise, a rustling in the distance. He turned sharply, his heart racing, but saw nothing, just the stray cat that had wandered closer, its curious eyes fixed on him. Letting out a shaky breath, Walter closed the trunk gently, as if he could somehow hide the secret it now contained. He leaned against the side of the car, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool breeze. The cash wasn't just money. It was a challenge, a test, perhaps even a curse. Walter had spent his life fixing broken things, but this was something else entirely. Little did he know, opening that trunk was just the beginning of a journey that would unravel his quiet life and force him to confront choices he never thought he'd have to make. Walter sat at his worn wooden workbench that evening, the smell of grease and oil mixing with the faint aroma of the stew he had left simmering on the stove. The car and its startling secret weighed on his mind like an immovable boulder. He'd seen plenty of strange things in his decades as a mechanic, hidden compartments, forgotten keepsakes, but nothing like this. $2 million, or at least what he estimated was $2 million, judging by the size and number of bundles. It was absurd, almost comical, and yet it was real. His hands, still trembling from the discovery, reached for the mug of coffee he had poured an hour earlier. It was cold now, but he drank it anyway, hoping it might steady him. The thought came quickly, as natural as breathing. What if I kept it? He didn't say the words aloud, but they echoed in his mind nonetheless. For a man who had spent his entire life living paycheck to paycheck, the temptation was as undeniable as the stacks of cash themselves. Walter's house was paid off, but it was crumbling around him. The shop, while functional, hadn't seen new tools in over 20 years. And then there were the hospital bills, Martha's cancer treatments, which had drained every last cent of their savings. Even now, the thought of those unpaid debts made his chest tighten. $2 million could fix all of that. It could change his life. It could give him peace. But as quickly as the thought came, so did the guilt. Walter had been raised by a father who preached honesty like it was scripture, a man who believed your name was only as good as your word. If it ain't yours, don't touch it, his father would say, often while lecturing a young Walter about the value of hard work. Those words had stuck with him, guiding him through decades of grueling labor and lean times. But tonight, they felt more like a taunt than a lesson. What would you say now, Dad? He wondered bitterly. Would his father have been so quick to judge if he lived long enough to see the bills pile up, or the way Walter had quietly sold off Martha's beloved antiques just to keep the lights on? The minutes dragged into hours as Walter debated with himself, his mind ricocheting between possibilities. Reporting the money seemed like the right thing to do, the obvious thing. He could call the sheriff first thing in the morning, explain the situation, and let them handle it. But the thought of law enforcement involved made his skin crawl. Walter didn't trust the system, not entirely. Who's to say they wouldn't pocket some of it themselves? Worse, what if they accused him of theft? He had no proof he hadn't known about the money before today, and small-town gossip had a way of painting people guilty before the truth came out. Then there was the other option, the one that sent a shiver of both excitement and fear down his spine. Keep it. No one had seen him open the trunk, and the car didn't appear to have a rightful owner. It had been abandoned, after all. If the money belonged to someone dangerous, they probably wouldn't report it missing. Walter could stash the cash, maybe use a little here and there, enough to fix the shop or buy a reliable truck. He'd be careful, quiet. No one would ever know. He laughed bitterly at the thought. No, he wasn't that kind of man. Even if he wanted to keep the money, he wouldn't know where to start. Walter Jenkins didn't have a criminal bone in his body. and the idea of hiding such a fortune felt as alien as flying to the moon. Still, the image lingered, tantalizing in its simplicity and debt-free, living the rest of his days without worry. Martha's voice echoed faintly in his mind, gentle and reassuring. "You've always done the right thing, Walt. That's why I married you." He closed his eyes, letting the memory of her voice wash over him. It felt like a reminder, a nudge toward the man he had always tried to be. But there was another voice, quieter, darker, whispering doubts into the corners of his mind. Who would it really hurt if you kept it? The thought unsettled him, not because he wanted to believe it, but because part of him did. For the first time in his 70 years, Walter felt the weight of his mortality. How many years did he have left? How many more winters in a drafty house or summers sweating in an unair-conditioned shop? Wasn't it time life gave him something back? Walter stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. He paced the small room, his boots leaving faint marks on the concrete. The stew on the stove had long since gone cold, forgotten in the swirl of his thoughts. He looked at the clock, 11:47 p.m. He needed to sleep, but his mind wouldn't quiet. The photograph he'd found in the car was still in his pocket, crumpled from the day's work. He pulled it out, studying the faces of the smiling couple once again. They looked so happy, so carefree. Were they the owners of the money? Had this car been theirs? Or had they lost it to someone else, someone who had no right to it? Eventually, Walter made his way to the couch, too restless to go to bed. He sat there in the dark, the photograph resting on the coffee table in front of him like an unanswered question. The money had been hidden for a reason, that much was clear. But whose reason? And what did it mean for him? The small-town mechanic who had spent his whole life fixing other people's problems now found himself faced with one he couldn't repair, no matter how skilled his hands were. As dawn began to break and the first hints of sunlight crept through the curtains, Walter still hadn't made a decision. The only thing he knew for certain was that his life had been irrevocably changed. Whether he kept the money, reported it, or tried to find its rightful owner, nothing would ever be the same. And somehow deep down, he sensed that this was just the beginning. The sun had barely risen above the rooftops when the sound of a car pulling into the gravel lot outside jolted Walter from his restless days. He rubbed his eyes, glancing at the clock, 6:15 a.m. No one ever came this early. His heart quickened as he stood, peering out the front window. A sleek black sedan, polished to a mirror shine, had parked in front of his shop. The driver stepped out, tall and sharply dressed in a dark suit, his movements precise and deliberate. Walter's stomach tightened. This wasn't a local. He could tell by the way the man carried himself. Too smooth, too confident, like someone used to getting answers. The man approached the workshop door, his polished shoes clicking against the gravel. Walter opened the door before he could knock, masking his unease with a gruff but polite, "Morning. Can I help you?" The man's gaze swept over Walter, assessing him in a way that felt almost clinical. "Good morning, sir," he said, his voice cool and measured. "My name's Richard Devereaux. I'm looking for a car, a green 57 Chevy Bel Air. I was told it might be here." Walter's heart skipped a beat. His face remained calm, but the name of the car sent a jolt through him. So it had an owner after all. He crossed his arms, leaning casually against the doorframe, trying to appear unbothered. "A green Bel Air, huh? One like that did show up yesterday. Why? You the owner?" Devereaux's lips curled into a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Not exactly. I represent someone who's very interested in that vehicle. You could say it's sentimental to them." The way he said it made Walter's skin crawl. There was no sentiment in this man's tone, only calculation. Walter thought of the money in the trunk, the neat stacks of cash wrapped like they were meant to be hidden forever. Whoever this man was, he didn't seem the type to care about nostalgia. Well, it's in the lot, Walter replied cautiously. You're welcome to take a look, but I'll need proof of ownership before I hand it over. You know how it is. Devereaux's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. Of course, he said smoothly. I'll make sure you get everything you need. May I see the car? Walter hesitated but nodded, leading the man to the Bel Air. As they approached, Devereaux's demeanor shifted. He circled the car slowly, his fingers brushing against the faded paint as if he were searching for something. Beautiful, isn't it? He said, his tone almost wistful. Walter watched him carefully, noting the way his eyes lingered on the trunk, his fingers tracing the edges of the lock. Shame it's in such rough shape. This car's been through a lot. You know something about it? Walter asked, feigning casual curiosity. Devereaux glanced at him, his expression unreadable. It belonged to a man named Franklin Grayson, he said, a veteran. He was a family friend. The name rang no bells for Walter, but he didn't let on. Grayson, huh? He leave it here. Devereaux chuckled softly, the sound devoid of humor. Not exactly. He passed away some years ago. The car's been missing ever since. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Walter's mind raced. If the car had been missing for years, how had it ended up in front of his shop? And why now? I see, he said slowly. So you're here to bring it back to the family? Devereaux's eyes darkened. Something like that. Let's just say it's better off in my hands. Safer. Walter didn't like the sound of that. He shifted uncomfortably, his instincts screaming that this man wasn't telling the whole truth. Well, like I said, I'll need proof before I release it. Can't just hand it over to anyone who comes asking. Devereaux's smile returned, sharper this time. Of course. I wouldn't expect anything less. I'll be back with the paperwork. With that, he turned on his heel and strode back to his car. Walter watched as the sleek sedan disappeared down the road, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. Something about Devereaux didn't add up. The man had spoken of Grayson with practiced ease, but there was no warmth in his voice, no hint of personal connection. And then there was the way he had looked at the car, like a predator sizing up its prey. Walter returned to the shop, his mind buzzing. He pulled a photograph from his pocket, studying the smiling couple once more. Could one of them have been Franklin Grayson? And if so, what had they been hiding? He thought of the money again, the pristine stacks that seemed too perfect, too deliberate. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the cash was tied to something far bigger than he'd first imagined. That evening, as Walter sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the window at the car illuminated by the glow of a street lamp, he realized the choice he had to make was more complicated than he'd thought. Reporting the money wasn't just about doing the right thing anymore. It was about protecting himself. Devereaux wasn't going to let this go. Walter could feel it in his bones. The question wasn't just what to do with the money. It was how to keep himself safe while doing it. As the night stretched on, Walter's thoughts turned darker. What if Grayson's family never came forward? What if the money had been earned through blood and betrayal? And what if Devereaux wasn't the only one looking for it? For the first time in his life, Walter felt like he was caught in a storm he couldn't navigate, and the only thing he knew for certain was that he couldn't trust anyone, not even himself. Walter's shop had always been a quiet corner of the town, a place where locals dropped by to chat more often than to repair their aging vehicles. But in the days following Devereaux's visit, it seemed as though the world had decided to descend on him all at once. At first, it was subtle, an unfamiliar car parked down the street for hours, its occupants hidden behind dark-tinted windows. Walter noticed them while sweeping the shop's porch, their presence a strange blip in the otherwise predictable rhythm of his mornings. He told himself it was nothing, perhaps tourists lost on their way through the countryside. But then the phone call started. "Hello, Jenkins Auto," Walter answered one morning, his voice weary from another restless night. There was silence on the other end, the kind that hummed with the faint static of an open line. "Hello," he repeated, gripping the receiver tighter. The call ended abruptly with a click. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated, early calls with no one speaking, as if someone was waiting to hear his voice, to confirm he was there. Walter began to feel like a man being watched, his every move scrutinized by unseen eyes. By the end of the week, the visits began. The first was a man in his mid-30s, dressed casually, but with a demeanor that screamed authority. "Afternoon," the man said, stepping into the shop. His smile was too wide, his handshake too firm. "Name's Eric. Just passing through, but I heard you're the guy to see if I need car trouble fixed." Walter didn't buy it. The man's car, a pristine rental, sat idling outside, its engine purring like a contented cat. "That's so," Walter replied, wiping his hands on a rag and squinting at the man. "Funny, I haven't seen you around before." Eric chuckled, his gaze darting around the shop like he was cataloging every tool and corner. "First time in town," he said. "Nice place. Quiet. Real to private." The way he emphasized the word made Walter's stomach churn. "You've been here long?" Eric asked casually, leaning against the counter as if they were old friends. "Long enough," Walter replied, keeping his tone clipped. "Look, if you've got a problem with your car, I'll take a look. Otherwise, I've got work to do." Eric's smile faltered slightly, but he nodded and straightened up. "Nah, nothing wrong with the car," he said. "Just wanted to introduce myself. Maybe I'll swing by later if I need anything." He lingered for a moment, his eyes locking with Walter's in a way that felt like a warning before he finally walked out. Walter stood in the shop doorway, watching Eric drive off, his mind racing. He dealt with plenty of difficult customers in his time, but this felt different. This wasn't about a car, it was about the Bel Air. Over the next few days, more strangers appeared. Some came to the shop with vague excuses, others simply loitered outside, their presence as unwelcome as storm clouds on the horizon. Walter's once peaceful routine was now punctuated by unease. He began double-checking the locks on his doors, glancing over his shoulder whenever he stepped outside. The worst part was the feeling of isolation. He couldn't exactly call the sheriff and say, "Hey, I've got $2 million in a car trunk, and now people are sniffing around." It was a secret that kept him trapped, a burden too heavy to share. The turning point came late one evening. Walter was in his kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound as he sipped a cup of tea. A sudden knock at the door made him jump, spilling tea onto the counter. He hadn't been expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. Wiping his hands, he approached the door cautiously, his heart pounding. Through the peephole, he saw a man standing on the porch, a burly figure in a leather jacket, his face shadowed by the dim porch light. Walter opened the door just a crack, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "Can I help you?" The man didn't smile. "You Walter Jenkins?" he asked, his tone gruff. "Who's asking?" Walter replied, not moving an inch. "Just someone looking for a car," the man said. "Heard you've got a green Chevy out back." Walter's grip on the door tightened. "Not sure where you heard that," he said evenly. "I don't discuss other folks' business." The man's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching at his side. "Listen, old man," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening growl. "You don't want to make this hard on yourself. Just tell me where the car is, and we'll both be better off." Walter felt his pulse hammering in his ears, but he didn't back down. "I think you should leave," he said firmly, his gaze steady despite the fear clawing at him. The man stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sharp nod, he turned and walked away, his boots crunching loudly against the gravel. Walter watched him disappear into the night, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease even after the sound of the man's car faded into the distance. That night, Walter sat at his kitchen table, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like never before. The money wasn't just a moral dilemma anymore. It was a danger, a threat that could cost him everything. He thought about calling the sheriff, about handing over the cash and washing his hands of the whole mess. But then he thought of Devereaux, of Eric, of the man in the leather jacket. If he handed over the money, who's to say they wouldn't come after him anyway? The people circling his shop weren't the kind to let loose ends dangle. As dawn broke over the horizon, Walter realized he was facing a battle he hadn't signed up for, one he couldn't afford to lose. The car had brought more than money. It had brought danger, secrets, and a choice that would define the rest of his life. And for the first time, Walter felt like the weight of it all might just be too much to bear. The next morning, Walter decided he couldn't let the unanswered questions fester any longer. He didn't know who he could trust, but he knew one thing for certain: he needed to understand the history of the car and the money it carried. He carefully lifted the photograph from the coffee table, studying the young couple's smiling faces once more. The man's slicked back hair and confident grin had a familiar quality, something that tugged at the edges of Walter's memory. He flipped the photo over, hoping for some kind of clue, and found faint writing in pencil on the back. F. Grayson and Margaret, July 12, 1958. Grayson, Walter muttered under his breath. That was the name Devereaux had mentioned, a World War II veteran, he'd said. But Margaret, Devereaux hadn't spoken of her. The wheels in Walter's mind began to turn. If this was Franklin Grayson and Margaret, then who was Devereaux really? And why did he want the car? It wasn't just the money. Walter was certain of that now. There was something deeper, something tangled in the roots of the past. His instincts told him the answers lay in the car itself. Determined, Walter grabbed his toolbox and headed outside. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel lot, the Bel Air gleaming faintly beneath its layer of dust. He opened the trunk again, his heart pounding as he stared at the bundles of cash. But this time, his focus wasn't on the money. He ran his hands along the edges of the trunk, searching for anything that might have been overlooked. After several minutes, his fingers brushed against something unusual, a small panel near the back of the trunk. It was barely visible, its edges hidden beneath the lining. Walter grabbed a screwdriver and pried it open. Inside was a small, weathered leather pouch, its surface cracked with age. Walter carefully pulled it out, his hands trembling slightly. He opened the pouch to reveal a stack of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The scent of old paper wafted up, and Walter's breath caught in his throat as he unfolded the first letter. It was dated August 1945, just after the end of the war. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the kind of script that spoke of a different era. The letter began, "My dearest Margaret, the world feels heavier today than it ever has, and yet I find myself clinging to the thought of you, of us. The things I've seen, the things I've done, they haunt me. But if I can make it home to you, I'll spend the rest of my days making it right." Walter paused, the words sinking in. Franklin Grayson had been a soldier, and these letters were love letters, written during one of the darkest chapters of history. He read on, piece by piece, uncovering a story that was as heartbreaking as it was revealing. Franklin had returned from the war deeply scarred, not just physically, but emotionally. He had carried guilt, secrets, and a sense of duty that had driven him to protect Margaret at all costs. As Walter sifted through the letters, a clearer picture began to emerge. One letter, dated years later, stood out. Franklin wrote about coming into a large sum of money, not through crime, but through a gamble that had paid off in ways he hadn't expected. He had used it to secure a future for Margaret and their unborn child, hiding it in the car as a last-ditch effort to protect them from those who might want to take it away. The words were heavy with desperation and love, each sentence a testament to Franklin's devotion. But what struck Walter the most was the closing line of that letter. "If you ever find this, know that everything I did was for you. Forgive me for the things I couldn't say." Walter sat back, the letter trembling in his hands. This wasn't just about money. It was about love, sacrifice, and the impossible choices people make to protect those they care about. Franklin Grayson hadn't been a criminal. He'd been a man trying to shield his family from a world that had already taken so much from him. But something had gone wrong. Margaret and the child had never claimed the car, never reclaimed the money. And now, decades later, it had ended up here in Walter's quiet little shop. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Walter jumped, his heart racing. He quickly stuffed the letters back into the pouch and hid them beneath his workbench before going to the door. It was the mailman, delivering the usual stack of bills and advertisements. But as Walter closed the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Back at the workbench, he stared at the pouch, the weight of the letters pressing down on him. He thought of Margaret and the child. If they were still alive, they deserved to know the truth. But finding them wouldn't be easy, and he couldn't ignore the danger looming over him. Devereaux wasn't just going to walk away. And then there were the others, the strangers who had come sniffing around, their motives as murky as the water in a clogged radiator. For the first time since discovering the money, Walter felt a spark of resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore. Franklin's story, Margaret's story, it wasn't finished. And maybe, just maybe, it was up to Walter to write the final chapter. But the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty, and the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it seemed to become. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Walter sat alone in his shop, the letters spread out before him like pieces of a puzzle. He didn't know where the path would lead, but one thing was clear: he couldn't turn back now. The weight of Walter's discovery and the growing threat around him began to seep into the town, subtly at first, like whispers carried on the wind. Word of the green Bel Air, parked conspicuously in his lot, started making its way into conversations at the diner, the grocery store, and even the church. Small towns had a way of magnifying secrets, and although no one knew about the money yet, the mystery of the car was enough to ignite curiosity. For Walter, it was like standing in the eye of a storm, surrounded by people he had known for years, all of them now looking at him as though he held the key to some unspoken treasure. It started with the harmless visits. Longtime customers dropped by the shop with thinly veiled excuses. "Hey there, Walt," old Mr. Higgins said, leaning heavily on his cane as he lingered near the open garage door. "Heard you got yourself a bit of a mystery car. Bet it's got some stories to tell, huh?" Walter smiled politely, his responses curt and guarded. "Just another old junker someone left behind," he'd reply, hoping to steer the conversation elsewhere. But the questions kept coming, each one prying a little deeper. By the end of the week, the harmless curiosity had turned into something sharper. At the local hardware store, Walter overheard two women whispering near the paint aisle. "They say Jenkins is sitting on something big," one murmured, her voice tinged with both envy and suspicion. "What if it's stolen goods? Or worse?" The other woman gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "You think he's in trouble?" Walter ducked into another aisle before they could spot him, his chest tightening at the realization that the town's eyes were now firmly on him. The whispers turned into demands after the first real confrontation. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, the air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and charcoal smoke from backyard barbecues. Walter was in his garage, tinkering with a carburetor, when a group of neighbors gathered outside. At the forefront was Dale Peterson, a loudmouth contractor who always seemed to know everyone's business. "Walter," Dale called out, leaning on the hood of his truck with an air of mock camaraderie, "how about you tell us what's really going on with that car of yours?" Folks are curious. Walter set his tools down, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped out into the sunlight. Nothing to tell, he said firmly. Just a car someone abandoned. I'm fixing it up, that's all. Dale smirked, crossing his arms. Come on, Walt. We all know there's more to it than that. A guy like you doesn't just keep secrets unless there's something worth hiding. The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Walter felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. I don't owe anyone an explanation, he said evenly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do. He turned to leave, but Dale's voice stopped him in his tracks. You can't keep it all to yourself, you know. If there's something valuable in that car, the whole town deserves to benefit. We've all struggled. You're not the only one. Walter spun around, his eyes blazing. Struggled, he snapped. You think I don't know what struggle is? I buried my wife, patched up this shop with my bare hands, and kept food on my table without asking a soul for help. Don't come here talking about what I owe you. You don't know the first thing about what I'm dealing with. The crowd fell silent, Dale shrinking under Walter's glare. Slowly, the neighbors began to disperse, their curiosity tempered for the moment by Walter's fierce resolve. But the damage was done. The town had turned into a powder keg of speculation, and Walter was at the center of it. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Walter sat on the porch of his house, staring out at the car silhouetted in the dim light. He thought about the community he had lived in for over 4 decades, a place that had always felt like home. But now it felt different, less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The money wasn't just a threat from the outside anymore. It was corroding the very fabric of his relationships. Yet, amid the greed and suspicion, there were moments of kindness that reminded Walter of the town's better nature. The next morning, Sarah, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her kids, stopped by the shop. She handed Walter a small loaf of banana bread, her hands trembling slightly. Just thought you could use something to brighten your day, she said softly. Walter smiled, his voice catching in his throat as he thanked her. Sarah hesitated before adding, Whatever's going on, Walt, just know there are still folks here who trust you. Her words lingered with him, a faint ember of hope in an otherwise dark time. Walter began to realize that the money had revealed not only the worst in people, but also the best. The town's reactions weren't just about greed. They were a reflection of desperation, of years spent scraping by and longing for something better. He thought of Sarah, of her struggles, and of all the others like her. Maybe the money could be more than a curse. Maybe it could be a way to give back, to repair what had been broken, not just in the town, but in himself. But even as Walter entertained a thought, he couldn't ignore the shadows creeping closer. Devereaux was still out there, and so were the others, their motives as murky as ever. The community's reaction had shown him the stakes, but it had also given him clarity. The money wasn't just a pile of cash, it was a catalyst, a force that could destroy or heal, depending on how it was wielded. And Walter, for better or worse, was the one holding the reins. As the stars began the night sky, Walter sat in the quiet of his porch, the weight of the town's hopes and fears pressing down on him. He didn't know how the story would end, but one thing was clear, he couldn't carry this burden alone. He needed to make a decision, and he needed to make it soon, before the community, the strangers, or the secrets of the past consumed him entirely. The morning dawned heavy with the scent of rain, the gray clouds overhead casting long shadows over Walter's workshop. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of calm, not the absence of tension, but quiet resolve that came from knowing what had to be done. The money, the car, the whispers in town, and the lurking strangers, they had all converged into a singular truth. This wasn't just his burden to carry. The story of Franklin Grayson, Margaret, and the hidden fortune wasn't just about him. It was a thread woven through the lives of many, and it was time to let it go. Walter started his day as he always did, with a steaming cup of black coffee and the sound of birds chirping outside his kitchen window. But his mind wasn't on the small comforts of routine. Instead, it was fixed on the letters he had read late into the night, the words of a man who had loved deeply and sacrificed everything to protect his family. Franklin's intentions had been noble, but the money had become a specter, haunting every life it touched. Walter didn't want to be its next victim, or its keeper. He knew that whatever he decided, it had to honor the legacy of the Graysons, not just his own desires. The first step was to find Margaret, or her descendants, if she was no longer alive. Walter wasn't much for technology, but he knew enough to piece together some clues. With the letters spread across his kitchen table, he scoured the return addresses and signatures, piecing together a rough timeline of Franklin and Margaret's life. He jotted down notes, cross-referencing them with names he remembered from his years in the town. It was tedious work, but by the afternoon, he had a promising lead, an address in a neighboring city where Margaret's family had lived decades ago. Walter packed a small bag and locked up the shop, leaving a simple note on the door, closed for the day. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, not even Sarah, who had stopped by earlier with another loaf of bread and a concerned look in her eyes. He couldn't risk anyone trying to follow him or tipping off the wrong people. The drive to the city was uneventful, the rain tapping against the windshield like a metronome, steady and relentless. Walter's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he rehearsed what he might say to Margaret, or whoever answered the door. Would they believe him? Would they even want to hear about Franklin and the money? When he arrived at the address, his heart sank. The modest brick house was in disrepair, its windows boarded up and the yard overgrown with weeds. A faded "for sale" sign leaned precariously in the front yard. Walter sat in his truck, staring at the house as the rain continued to fall. It felt like a dead end, another reminder that time didn't wait for anyone. But as he was about to leave, a voice called out from the sidewalk, "You looking for someone?" Walter turned to see an older woman bundled in a raincoat, her face framed by a halo of graying curls. "Yeah," Walter said, stepping out of the truck. "I was looking for the Grayson family. Used to live here, I think." The woman's eyes softened with recognition. "Grayson, you say? Margaret Grayson was my aunt. She passed away years ago. God rest her soul." Walter's heart sank further, but the woman continued. "Her daughter, though, Annie, she's still around. Lives a few blocks over, I think. Why are you looking for them?" Walter hesitated, the weight of the letters in his pocket grounding him. "It's complicated," he said finally, "but it's important. Family business, you could say." The woman nodded slowly, her curiosity evident but unspoken. She gave him directions to Annie's house, and Walter thanked her before climbing back into his truck, his pulse quickening with each turn of the wheel. Annie Grayson's house was a modest, well-kept home with flower boxes beneath the windows and a small porch swaying gently in the breeze. Walter knocked on the door, his stomach twisting with nerves. A moment later, the door opened to reveal a woman in her late 50s, her eyes sharp but kind, framed by the same curls Walter had seen in the photograph of Margaret. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious but polite. "Annie Grayson?" Walter asked, his voice steadier than he felt. She nodded. "Yes, and you are." Walter took a deep breath, reaching into his pocket to pull out the photograph. "My name's Walter Jenkins. I think this belongs to you." He handed her the photograph, and Annie's face softened as she took it, her fingers brushing over the worn edges. "That's my mother," she said quietly, "and my grandfather." Walter nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I found it in a car, Bel Air. It was left at my shop. And there's more. A lot more." He hesitated, unsure of how much to say. Your grandfather left something behind. Something he wanted to protect. Over the next hour, Walter shared everything: the car, the money, the letters, and the people who had come looking for it. Annie listened intently, her expression shifting from surprise to sadness and finally to a quiet determination. "He always said he'd do anything to protect us," she said softly. "But I had no idea. I didn't even know the car still existed." Together, they decided the money couldn't stay hidden any longer. It had to be used for something good, something that honored Franklin's sacrifices while protecting Annie's family from the dangers Walter had faced. With her blessing, Walter contacted a lawyer in the city to help set up a fund in Franklin's name. The money would go towards supporting veterans, single mothers, and struggling families, people like Sarah, who become a quiet beacon of hope in Walter's own life. As Walter and Annie finalized the details, a sense of peace settled over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was on solid ground. The money wasn't his burden anymore. It was a gift, a chance to rewrite the story of Franklin Grayson's legacy, not as one of secrecy and fear, but as one of love and generosity. But as Walter prepared to return home, a nagging feeling tugged at him. The strangers who had come looking for the car weren't going to disappear just because the money was gone. There was still one piece of the puzzle left to solve, one last chapter of the story waiting to be written. Walter returned to the shop late that night, the steady hum of his old truck's engine a comforting reminder that some things were still within his control. The streets were quiet, the town shrouded in the stillness of a late hour. As he pulled into his gravel lot, he spotted something unusual: the faint glow of headlights parked down the street. His chest tightened. He hadn't told anyone about his trip to see Annie, but he had known deep down that the shadowy figures circling his life wouldn't disappear so easily. He parked the truck and walked briskly to the shop, his every movement deliberate. Inside, the letters and other documents from Franklin's pouch were still spread across his workbench. Walter locked the door behind him and pulled the blinds closed. He hadn't kept the money. Every last dollar was now in the hands of lawyers and trustees working to establish the fund, but the papers still felt like a secret too valuable to leave unprotected. Walter leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the letters one more time. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe something he'd missed, something that could explain why these strangers were so interested in the car. His fingers brushed over a final envelope he hadn't opened yet, sealed and tucked beneath the stack of letters. It was addressed to Margaret, but the handwriting was slightly different, shakier, as if Franklin had written it in his later years. With a deep breath, Walter carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The words were few, but their weight was immense. "Margaret, if you find this, it means I've failed to protect what matters most. I hid the money, but it was never about the money. It was always about the truth. Inside the car, beneath the passenger seat, is something no one else can ever see. Not Devereaux, not the men who've come before him. Burn it if you must, but don't let it fall into the wrong hands. I did what I could to keep us safe. Please forgive me. Franklin." Walter read the letter twice, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and dread. Beneath the passenger seat. He had worked on the car for days and never thought to check there. The money had been a distraction, a red herring meant to draw attention away from what Franklin had truly hidden. The realization sent a shiver down Walter's spine. Whatever Franklin had hidden, it wasn't just valuable, it was dangerous. He grabbed a flashlight and headed out to the Bel Air, the cool night air prickling his skin. The headlights down the street were still there, but the car hadn't moved. Walter ignored it, focusing instead on the task at hand. He opened the passenger door and slid the seat forward, the old leather creaking beneath his hands. The floor beneath was covered in dust and bits of debris, but as he ran his fingers along the edges, he felt it, a small metal latch hidden beneath the carpeting. With a quick tug, the latch released, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a single item, a weathered leather journal, its cover embossed with the initials F.G. Walter's hands trembled as he pulled it out, the weight of it heavy both physically and metaphorically. He opened it to the first page, his breath catching as he read the words scrawled in Franklin's unmistakable hand. The truth about what happened on July 17, 1945, at the Osiris facility. Walter's brow furrowed. Osiris facility? The name meant nothing to him, but as he flipped through the pages, the story began to unfold. Franklin had been part of a top-secret operation during the war, something involving experimental technologies and classified missions. The details were hazy, written in fragmented sentences, but the underlying message was clear. Whatever had happened at the Osiris facility, it had been enough to haunt Franklin for the rest of his life. There were names, dates, and locations scattered throughout the journal, some underlined, others circled. Walter didn't understand most of it, but he knew one thing for sure. This journal was why Devereaux and the others had been so desperate to find the car. As Walter sat there, piecing together Franklin's cryptic notes, he heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel. He froze, his heart pounding as the footsteps grew louder. Someone was outside, and they weren't bothering to hide it anymore. Walter closed the journal and slid it into his jacket, his mind racing. He grabbed a wrench from the workbench and stepped outside, the cold metal heavy in his hand. Standing near the car was Devereaux, his sharp suit now slightly rumpled, his face shadowed under the dim light of the street lamp. "Evening, Mr. Jenkins," he said, his tone calm but edged with menace. "I was hoping we could have a chat." Walter tightened his grip on the wrench, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I don't have the money," he said flatly. "It's gone. Given to the right people." Devereaux smirked, shaking his head. "You think this is about the money? That was just the bait. What I'm here for is something far more valuable, and I think you know exactly what I mean." Walter didn't respond, his mind racing through his options. He knew Devereaux wasn't bluffing, but he also knew he couldn't let the journal fall into his hands. "You're wasting your time," Walter said, stepping closer to the car. "There's nothing here for you." Devereaux's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mr. Jenkins. Just hand over what you found, and we'll both walk away from this in one piece." Walter's next words surprised even himself. "I don't think you're in a position to make that call," he said, his voice low and firm. Devereaux's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a pair of headlights lit up the lot. Another car pulled in, this one a police cruiser. The sheriff stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Everything all right here, Walt?" he asked, his gaze shifting between Walter and Devereaux. Devereaux's composure slipped for just a moment, but it was enough for Walter to see the truth. He was bluffing. The man wasn't as untouchable as he pretended to be. Walter nodded at the sheriff, his voice calm. "Just a misunderstanding. This gentleman was just leaving." Devereaux hesitated, but with the sheriff watching, he had no choice. He muttered something under his breath before turning and walking back to his car, his figure disappearing into the night. As the cruiser drove off, Walter stood alone in the quiet lot, the journal still tucked safely in his jacket. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. The real fortune Franklin had left behind wasn't money. It was the truth. And now it was up to Walter to decide what to do with it.